We have the honor now of hearing from someone whose work defining the priorities for climate action helped lay the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. He served as Executive Director for the Caribbean region at the Inter-American Development Bank, as Ambassador of Barbados to the United States, and as Director of the Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team, among many other roles. Let's extend a warm welcome to Assistant Secretary General of the Climate Action Team and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General, Selwin Hart. Thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So why don't we jump right in? It would be wonderful to hear what you think the folks out there need to know about where we are in the climate crisis right now. What is it that everyone needs to grasp?
Well, the Secretary General said it best just a few days ago. The climate emergency needs to be priority number one on the agenda of every government and every multilateral organization. The reality is, when one looks at every indicator on climate, we're heading in the wrong direction. Global emissions are at their highest levels in human history and continue to rise. And we're seeing unprecedented climate impacts on every continent, in every region, and in every country. The science tells us that we have a very narrow window of opportunity to take the actions that are necessary to prevent even more catastrophic climate chaos. So we need to take actions now. Now, not in 2050, not in 2030, but now.
Why do you think that urgency hasn't translated, if it hasn't, and what can we do to sort of ramp it up in the audience for all of these issues, but specifically for what you're talking about right now with respect to climate?
Well, on the urgency front, we need all hands on deck. We need governments to set clear policy direction. We need the private sector to shift their investments from carbon pollution to solutions, climate solutions like renewable energy. And we also need people to look at their lifestyles and make the necessary changes so that we can make a dent in the climate crisis. The good news is that we know what needs to be done, right? We need to reduce emissions. We need more renewable energy. We need at least 60% of electricity generation from renewable energy by 2030. We have the financial tools to do it. We need to stop investing in coal. We need to stop investing in natural gas and oil. Those are the practical things that need to be done. But we also need political will from governments. Leaders need to lead. Leaders need to take bold decisions.
That's a perfect sort of segue into COP, because that's one of the places where the ball gets moved forward. So what do you think needs to happen in the lead up to, at, and beyond COP27 to do exactly what you're saying?
Hey, well, we have about 40 days left to COP27. The reality is that this has been a very difficult year. In addition to the massive climate impacts that we're seeing in places like Pakistan, 33 million persons displaced, a third of the country underwater. We're also seeing multiple crises as well. The war in Ukraine. We're also seeing many developing countries in severe debt stress and debt situations. So COP27 needs to be that moment where we seek to reignite momentum around ambitious climate action. It means that we need to move on all fronts. We need to move on larger emission reduction targets, especially from the big emitters. We have 20 countries, the G20 countries, the world's largest, the world's richest countries. They account for 80% of global emissions. They need to do a lot more. But we also need to urgently move to protect people. We also need to increase support for adaptation and resilience. We also need to move on the finance issues that the developing world desperately need. And we also need to move on loss and damage. We've been negotiating climate change for about 30 years or so, 30 years. And issues of loss and damage have not found a permanent home in our discussions. COP27 represents that moment where we create a permanent space within the context of the negotiating process to have a frank and honest set of discussions on what actions need to be taken to address the issues of loss and damage. The reality is that if you're living in the developing world, if you're living in Africa, if you're living in South or Central America, if you're living in South Asia or on a small island developing state, you're 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. So loss and damage is already happening, and it's affecting those who have contributed least to the climate crisis. Right? So we, all of us, need to have some empathy for those who are suffering, and we need to find a space, as I said, to have a frank and honest discussion on what actions, practical actions need to be taken on the ground to support countries, people, and communities to address increasing loss and damage from the climate crisis.
Absolutely, and it feels like we need to see ourselves in them because it's a hop, skip, and a jump before the situation will be the same worldwide, no matter where you are. So you talked about leadership. I guess just generally speaking, what are the areas of consensus or the gaps amongst climate leaders in your experience?
Well, I think over the years, we have made some progress. No one really denies the science anymore. There is global.
Thank goodness.
Yes, exactly. There is global consensus that in order to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis, we need to hold the increase in global average temperature to 1.5. Now, this 1.5 degree goal was first advocated by the island states and the least developed countries. And they set that bar because for many of them, even at 1.5, many of these low-lying islands, especially in the Pacific, will disappear. So there is this global consensus on holding the increase in global in average temperature rise to 1.5. As of now, we're at about 1.2 degrees of warming. And if we don't reduce global emissions by half before the end of this decade, before 2030, then we will exceed that 1.5 degree goal. So I have no doubt that we will have a decarbonized world in the future. The problem is it might be too late for some folks. And so while there is global consensus on what we need to do, we're still not seeing the actions that are needed, that are absolutely needed to achieve our globally agreed climate goals. And that is the problem. We're just not moving fast enough.
How do we make that happen? Is it that we need to change the incentives? Are there opportunities inherent in climate action that we need to talk about? How do we actually get people to realize, particularly people in positions of power within their sector, that we are going to blow through that 1.5 number and worse on the trajectory we're on, and they do need to take immediate action and really bold and decisive action, even more than the urgency?
Yeah, it really needs, as I said earlier, that all hands on deck, all of government, all of society approach. And we need ordinary citizens to hold their leaders to account. Hold your leaders to account. Especially young people whose lives will be shaped by the actions that are taken now to address this climate crisis. We also need international institutions like the United Nations and the multilateral development banks to step up to the plate and become fit for purpose in addressing this climate crisis. And I'll just give you one example. The multilateral development banks, created over 70 years ago, right, in the ashes of World War II. Now we have a climate crisis, and these institutions really need to be repurposed in a way that allows them to mobilize the trillions of dollars that will be needed to ensure that developing countries can pursue a renewable energy, climate resilient future. These institutions occupy a privileged and unique place at the intersection between public finance and private finance. We need trillions of private finance redirected towards renewable energy and investments that help to build resilience and support communities and people to adapt to the climate crisis. So we need these institutions really to be creative, to take more risk, and help to channel that private finance towards the actions and activities in the developing world that would ensure developing countries are able to make massive investments in renewable energy to achieve that 60% of power generation by 2030, and at the same time ensure that developing countries can make investments in things like water, agriculture, and infrastructure to ensure that they are able to better adapt to an ever-changing climate.
Yes to all of that. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about accountability, because it is always a dream to hear leadership talk about how important that is. And as somebody who's also from the Caribbean region, from Guyana, that's something that we have always been focused on. So how do we hold leaders to account and actually use that to advance action on the SDGs?
Okay, well, fellow Caribbean person, always a great pleasure to speak.
Yes, we love to see
fellow Caribbean person. No, and this notion of accountability needs to occur at various levels. We definitely need to hold our leaders accountable. If you're living in a democracy, elections should matter. Climate should be the number one priority for, especially for young people. And even if you're not a young person, the reality is that climate impacts are happening now. If you have kids or grandkids, you need to ensure that your leaders are taking climate change seriously and that your leaders are making the investments to prepare your society and your economy for an ever worsening climate. We also need to hold our business leaders accountable as well. I just came from a meeting of financial actors, and over the course of the last year, a number of financial institutions and companies have made commitments to net zero by 2050. A number of them, however, have not put plans in place, either transition plans or other plans in place, to clearly show how they will meet this commitment some 30 years later. A financial institution cannot make a net zero claim, a net zero by 2050 claim or pledge. It is not credible. It is not credible if you don't have short-term targets. As I said earlier, what everyone does, governments, financial institutions, and corporates do during this decade matters. 30 years is fine, but what you do over now and over the course of this decade matters. So we need to demand accountability from companies we invest in. We need to demand accountability from companies we work for. For example, if a company is still investing in coal, in building new coal-fired power plants, that company or financial institution is part of the problem. They're investing in a stranded asset, and they are fueling the climate crisis. Because we know coal is the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels, and science tells us that the entire world must be out of coal by 2040.
And it's so obvious, right? But as you say, if they were making any other commitments, they would have a plan. So we have to make sure for these commitments, there's a plan too. So final question, first thing that comes to your mind, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Well, young persons like yourself who are fully engaged in the policy discussions. Your generation gives me hope. You are vocal, you're fighting for your lives, you're advocating. It reminds me of how my generation fought during the apartheid era, where we came out in numbers and we never gave up. So you give all of us hope. Please continue to fight. Never give up. Push all of us. Never accept false promises, and hold all of your leaders to account.
And I love push all of you, because that's the lesson. We can count on young people, but we need everybody engaged in the fight, and it matters to everyone. Selwin Hart, thank you so much. We so appreciate you being with us. And to everybody out there, stay tuned for more from the SDG Action Zone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.